ಬಂಡವಾಳ ಸಂಪುಟ 2 ಕೃತಿ ಬಿಡುಗಡೆ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವು ಜೂನ್ 2ರಂದು ನಡೆಯಿತು.
Marx is being dismissed as a minor post-Ricardian by mainstream economics. Paul Samuelson, the great doyen of neoclassical economics, is on record putting away Marx in a footnote as a minor post-Ricardian. But Marx refuses to go away. We refuse to go away, no matter what the exit polls say, no matter what the saint says. We will not go away, and that's something that's worth celebrating, because in a world of, that hankers after material goods, here is a group of people who are committed to seeing a better world and are willing to expend their lives on that goal. That's not easy. We all have families, we all have children, grandchildren. We live in a milieu where everybody else is somewhat different, shall we say, and yet we carry on. I think all of us owe ourselves a celebration. And that is the mood in which I am coming to talk with you today. When I went to economics after a BTech from IIT Madras, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which was mentioned earlier. And the first thing I must say is that I was completely politically innocent. I didn't know a thing about politics or about society. You're brought up in this country, especially if you have the access to education that some of us had, to automatically aspire to go into one of the IITs when you turn 16 or 17 without a clue as to what they're going to teach you or what you're going to become. I don't think I exercised any choice in that matter. Unfortunately, I did well in that exam. I wish I had done badly. But once I was in, there was no way I could say no. But the education wasn't altogether useless. It was useful in some ways. It was not exactly critical education. It didn't teach you to think critically about issues. And the first time I found that out, because we were very good at studying texts and reproducing them, responding to questions in the examinations, and we all got good marks, and we all got christened as good students, but we didn't really know much. We didn't know how to, address any issue, how to think critically. So when I went to the US, with this complete lack of exposure to critical thinking, and brought up in a very sheltered environment here, first thing that struck me when I walked into the University of Wisconsin in 1969, and just a year later, there was a massive movement going on in the US at that time. And I remember I went there in 69 August, and sometime in October 69, there was something called a teach-in. I had no idea what a teach-in was, okay, to be honest. These 3 days of teaching at the campus of the University of Wisconsin by militant anti-war activists. This is my first education, first exposure to something that I had no familiarity with. And after all, you go to US, you think of US as the land where Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and all that. You think of the Statue of Liberty, you have no idea of the other side of the picture. And this teaching raised questions and gave them some answers. And the most important thing was that, for me, was that I had not raised any of these questions. I had never been taught to raise questions. I had been taught to answer them. So this is a good encounter, because they were asking very simple questions. Vietnam is a very small country. US is a very powerful country. Vietnamese are not bombing New York. Why are we bombing Vietnam? Seemed to make sense to me. Although this has not been taught in my courses, not even the economics courses, by the way. The standard doctoral program in economics assumed that the real world didn't exist. They had their world of assumptions and models, and that was the real world that they were comfortable with. And there was nothing in mainstream economics that I was learning. And I was learning it very well, because you're all trained to do well in exams, right? So I was doing it extremely well, but I had no answer from mainstream economics to the questions that the workshop had raised, the teaching had raised. And then that's when I started reading. And then I stumbled upon a reading group on capital on the campus. Just 10 people, very, very tough. Every week we would meet, transact about 200 pages or 100 pages, depending on the density of the material, explain mutually to ourselves if points are not clear, and then do this for a very long time, because the first volume alone is about 800 odd pages. So, 3 volumes of Capital will take you a whole semester to finish, even if we met once a week. This was really my first exposure to Marx. There were two books that greatly influenced me at that time. One was Marx, the other was Simone de Beauvoir, the second sex. Phenomenal. I mean, completely transformed my attitude to gender issues. This kind of exposure you didn't get in the environment in which I studied in Chennai. So it was for me a very, very inspiring kind of transformation. And today, if I'm here with all of you, after about 40, 50 years of work in India on the left, I owe it to the people of Vietnam and to the exposure to Marx that I got in the late 60s. So I'm glad that I'm still continuing this journey, and that's why I wish I could read Kannada, so I could read these books that you have done. But you've got to forgive me and maybe tell me someday what they all contain. What I want to spend, I make my speech brief enough because there are other people to follow and they know much more, I'm sure, about what we're discussing here. In Kannada, they'll speak. So I'll keep mine a little short. I guess we are discussing volume 2 today. That's been released. Of course, there's also volume 1 and guide and all that. But volume 1 treats of the process of production. Volume 2 treats of the process of circulation. And volume 3 treats both of them together, the capitalist production as a whole. And it's appropriate that you're doing this as part of Engels 200 because Engels was the man who brought it to us in a sense, because Marx had left these in the form of notes, especially volume 2 and volume 3, and Engels has done a remarkable job of putting it together. And he's very modest in the preface he writes. He belittles his role, but it must have been an exceptionally important role because Marx can be difficult enough when there is a completed sentence, and even more difficult when it is not there. And Engels managed to really put together the entire manuscript. And when I went to this doctoral program in economics and wanted to understand, in 1969-70, after a very long period of relatively rapid economic growth in the capitalist world, post-World War II, from 1945 till 70 or so, there was not a single major economic recession across the world. There was only one minor recession, the US economy in 1958, what has been described by some as a blip on the radar. But otherwise, for capitalism to go through 25 years without a major downturn was unprecedented. And then, of course, we were soon to enter the recession in 1973, 74, 75. But what mainstream economics did not address at all, in all the courses I learned, was why do these economic fluctuations occur under capitalism? All you were taught was Keynes, and Keynes was all about demand, and if only the state could come in and spend money and raise demand, then you could address the issue of unemployment in the short run. In the long run, as Keynes said, we are all dead. So in the short run, you have to address unemployment by state spending. Even this is anathema to mainstream economics. They didn't at all release the idea of state coming in to prevent the capitalist economy from going into a deep recession, high levels of unemployment. Question was, none of my professors had a clue as to why capitalism underwent constant fluctuations. Keynes didn't either. Keynes was only looking at this issue of demand in the context of the depression of the 1930s. But throughout the history of capitalism, from the time that it evolved, there have been periodic downturns of a very severe kind. In fact, while Marx was writing Capital, the 1870s was the beginning of a very long depression, from early 1870s to about 1890s. And Marx was writing at some of his manuscripts came towards the first part of that period. But in mainstream economics, if you search the history of economic thought, you will not find a single treatise which looked at why capitalist economies fluctuate in this manner, why depressions occur periodically, and how does the economy pull itself out of depression. In their world, these problems did not exist. Their framework did not allow. In the pre-1917 world, before the Russian Revolution, these were treated routinely as natural events endemic to any economic system. No attempt was made to analyze it carefully and deeply, except for Marx. Marx was the only one who did. And so when suddenly they discovered Keynes, When I read Keynes and Marx, I found that a lot of Keynes was there already in Marx. Many of these issues had been dealt with by Marx. But in mainstream economics, this is not how Keynes himself was taught. Keynes was taught only in relation to aggregate demand, and then he moved on to how perfect the capitalist economy is, how efficient it is, and so on, how it allocates resources brilliantly, and so on. So we had a whole tradition of economics which did not look at problems of a capitalist economy at all. So for me then, from this mainstream economics curriculum to go to Marx was really quite a leap, because he gave us talking a strange language, saying some very different things from what I had been taught in the department. So the department was, professors were a little unhappy because I was one of the star students, and here I was going astray, reading Marx and doing sinful things of that kind. But gradually, as I read Marx in that capital study group and elsewhere, I realized this is really a far better way, far more, kind of effective way of understanding capitalism than anything I had been taught in the courses. So this is how I came to Marx. I came to Marx as a student studying economics, but I also came to Marx partly through the struggle of the Vietnamese people. So there was a good confluence, both theoretically and politically. I was drawn to the left almost in a natural way in that period. So in that sense, I'm very happy to associate myself with this function, although I have my own contribution to this function is very minimal. I'm just enjoying being here and celebrating the occasion with you all. But I think it's important to underline that to this day, mainstream economics has not produced anything that can help explain the business cycles and the long-term fluctuations of a capitalist economy in the manner that Marx has done in several places, but particularly in Volume 2, where he goes into the question of the production of capital and what are the uncertainties associated with that. And that is a bit difficult read in a sense in comparison to Volume 1, which is full of poetry. Volume 2 is a bit more terse, and there also Marx has some brilliant passages, but it's a bit more detailed in terms of numbers and so on. And I don't know how the translator has managed her or his job, but I'm sure that it must be very well done. But I would say this, that many of us may not need to read Capital on a daily basis. That's not how I look at it. If I have Capital volumes 1, 2 and 3 with me, like I did this week when I was asked by Vasant to come here, then I have a ready source to, anytime I have issues with the capitalist economy, its functioning, I don't understand something, I don't go to the newspapers, I go to Marx and try to understand why is this happening and what is it in the capitalist economy that's causing this. So it's that kind of a book. All the 3 volumes, I don't think they're exceptionally difficult, not my experience they were difficult. I think they're different. We are not used to that mode of exposition. But that mode of exposition is actually very brilliant, because if you look at it, the way he explains it, the way he presents his arguments, a great deal of thought has gone into it. Even Volume 1, when people say it's difficult, when you read the chapter on commodity, actually in the chapter on commodity, which is seen as difficult, Marx builds up a brilliant analytical structure, step by step. And actually if you read that once, twice, thrice, you really suddenly marvel that, hey, I've got it now. That's how that is the feeling I had often when I read Marx, that a passage which I had read earlier suddenly had a new meaning for me. Every time I read it, some additional meaning came into it. And that is the advantage. That is, I'm not making a pitch for marketing this book, but I'm certainly saying that it is good to have these 3 volumes with you at all times. Because anytime you ever see this issue, anytime you are bothered by exit polls, Marx is there for you to read and understand how capitalism works. And capitalism hasn't been able to get rid of Marx. They've tried very hard. I mean, I can tell you that there was a period in the US when you were a Marxist, you couldn't get a faculty position. There is still a period, even now in the US, where in most universities you can't do a study of Marx or Marxist thought. The history of economic thought is hardly taught for fear of infecting students with Marxist ideas. It's much worse in India. We are even more loyal than the king when it comes to being reactionary. But in the US also, apparently, plays a lot of freedom and all that. I found very difficult to find Marxist economists or Marxist theoreticians and work with them. And I think that itself is a tribute to how powerful Marx's thought has been, how powerful his writing has been. That people are terrified. The man's dead for how many years now? But we are still afraid of him. So obviously Marx has made a very profound impact on the whole psyche of capitalism and of people who live under capitalism, that the ruling classes still fear him. What Marx was saying in the manifesto was spectre haunting Europe in the middle of the 19th century. Spectre of Marx is still haunting capitalism in the 21st century. And that's where we are. That's why I think this kind of effort is extremely important. There are times in our movements when we are in the field and fighting battles on the street. There are also times when we need to go back and read the book carefully and understand the inner dynamics of capitalism. I think Marx's 3 volumes of Capital will definitely help us do that. In fact, if you read the preface by Engels, you'll see he also makes a reference to several manuscripts of Marx which he puts together later, and that is your volume 4 of Capital. It ends up being 3 volumes of the book called Theories of Surplus Value. And that's possibly, to this day, most comprehensive history of economic thought up to Marx's time. You don't really have a comparable history of economic thought from any other source. And subsequently, of course, the history of economic thought has become not a very desirable subject. And you must understand this is also important, that you see why, how does the ruling class, legitimize its rule and make sure that subversive ideas are kept limited in their spread. For example, when Marx, 2 examples I'll give you. One is, why did the Western world, advanced capitalist countries, not worry much about unemployment until 1917? They knew it was happening all the time, and that's just part of the game. But they didn't have to worry, because there was no living example of an alternative way of organizing economic life. Soviet Revolution offered the first instance of an alternative way of organizing economic life that didn't need capitalists. That's a very frightening thought for capitalists. You and I may, not see that quite accurately, but for a capitalist class, to see a country functioning perfectly well without capital is a very frightening thought. So that is why they made extraordinary efforts to destroy that country and that planned economy. And they of course succeeded, but after a very long battle. And that was the first battle in terms of 2 systems. So we struck it out for 70 odd years under great odds. So I'm confident that in the coming rounds of battles, we will ultimately win. There's no way the world can be organized in the manner driven by profit as capitalism does. If you go back and read not just the manifesto, but any text of Marx, including even the more difficult parts of Capital, what strikes you is because the title today is Reading Capital to Understand Capitalism of Today. What strikes you about reading Capital today, if you go back and read volume 1 of Capital, or volume 3 of Capital, or volume 2, is that it seems to be describing a globalizing world. In the period in which he was writing, which was this 1860s and 70s. So in a sense, Marx's work is possibly even more timely now than it was when it was written, because today the world is globally integrated and we are seeing the consequences. Many times we all wonder, why the progressive movement hasn't made great strides forward in our country. Don't forget that in the globalized economy of today, globalized polity of today, there's been a huge rightward shift in world politics. The question to ask is not why our progress is not as good as we might want it to be. The amazing question is, how are we surviving despite a global shift to the right? That's because of the fundamental vitality of the ideas that we possess, the fire that is there in us in terms of the world we want to build, and the analytical strength that Marx and his work gives us. Marx and Engels and their work gives us. And I think there's a great deal to be said. I do not want to get into the technical aspects of volume 2 of Capital. I'll miss half my audience if I do that. But I think that an occasion like this and the courage of all the team that worked on bringing this out and has the confidence that he'll be able to sell adequate number of copies in a world where reading has become almost obsolete. At least reading hard copy books has become almost obsolete. People do read digitally, but I don't see too many people reading hard copy books. And even I'm guilty of going there to the net and going to LibGen and stealing some books from the internet and reading them online. But in a world of that kind, to have these 3 volumes of Capital, which I still do, despite having given away all my books, I've still, clung on to my 3 volumes of Capital. Really, they're badly mashed. I've used them for 5 decades, and they're not in great shape. But I don't want to part with it because I have underlined passages across the 3 volumes. And anytime I have a doubt about contemporary economic crisis, something that's happening in the financial markets, you wouldn't believe it. If you want to understand how financial markets are functioning today, it's worth your while to go back and read Capital. That is the vitality of that book, and I think it's a great occasion that you've taken all this effort to bring out these volumes. You make me wish that I knew Kannada. Maybe I'll still do something about it. After all, Marx learned Russian at what age? 60. So we are all no Marxists, but one can still try to learn a language. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and my best wishes to all of you.